Hello again, and welcome to chessopenings.com. Today's video is all about the Vienna game, which begins with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e5, and knight c3. By developing the knight to c3, White is keeping his options open on the king side. He's avoided deploying the knight to f3, and for this reason, he can either choose sharp gambit play with the move pawn to f4, or he can play g3, looking for strategic setups with bishop g2. There's a lot to look at here, so let's get started. The Vienna game is characterized by this move, knight to c3 on move 2, remaining flexible on the king side and strengthening White's control of the light squares in the center. Now Black has a decision to make. Which knight does he want to deploy first in this position? If he brings the knight out to f6, this has the benefit of preparing an early pawn to d5 break, but the knight's location is surprisingly vulnerable in this position if White chooses the gambit play with f2 to e4, since in this case, if Black captures the pawn, as he generally doesn't in this position, e5 is a pretty strong move, and this knight has to go, probably it has to go all the way back home, since there are no other squares where it can't be captured, and this is a bad situation for Black. On the other hand, if Black deploys his queen's knight first, he's much better placed to handle the gambit options after pawn to f4, since now, after pawn takes pawn on f4, he doesn't have to worry about this move, e4 to e5, gaining time and space so easily. However, there is a drawback to deploying the knight to c6, which is that in this case, Black is doing less to support the d5 break. He's actually doing nothing to support the d5 break in this position, and this allows White a chance to play more slowly and strategically with g3 and bishop g2, and this is one of the downsides of moving the knight to c6. I think both moves are completely reasonable, and Black can successfully cope with the downsides of whichever strategy he happens to choose in this position. We'll start our analysis of this opening by taking a look at White's attempts to play strategically after knight c6 and pawn to g3. Now White has a simple idea in this position. What he's going to do is he's going to grip the d5 square and make it very difficult for Black to open up the game. Then more gradually, he hopes to set up a long-term break, pawn to f4, and he wants to set Black certain problems in this way, maybe build up a gradual kingside attack in this position. Now, Black's simplest reply is to deploy his bishop actively with this move, bishop to c5, and I think this is a very wise choice, since the bishop's presence on this diagonal will definitely make it more difficult for White to play f2 to f4 later, since he'll have to watch out for his king when he does castle kingside. Additionally, White's natural development of his bishop on c1, later he is going to want to deploy this bishop, and the bishop on c5 conveniently makes it a little bit less promising for White to bring out this bishop to its natural square on e3 without taking some damage to his pawn structure. So, in this position, play normally continues with the move bishop g2, and now Black has various options. One idea is simply to play d6, but I don't think there's any really good reason to allow White an opportunity to snatch the bishop pair with this move, knight a4. So instead of d6, I would recommend in this position that Black plays a6, and this was played by the ex-world champion Emanuel Lasker many decades ago. And this move simply creates an escape square for the bishop on a7, and only after White continues knight ge2, once again he's trying to avoid getting in front of this pawn because he definitely wants to expand to f4. But now that White has played this move, Black now plays d6, and he has an escape square for the bishop in this position. Play now often continues with pawn to d3, and now Black has options here, but quite frequently he also develops his knight to e7, also looking to play f5 at some point in this position. Theoretically speaking, this position doesn't offer a whole lot to White. The chief difference in the position lies in the deployment of the bishops. White's light-squared bishop sits on g2 and contributes to the bind on d5 and also contributes to the king's safety, whereas Black's bishop on c5 is perched a little bit more aggressively, spying on the f2 pawn and making it somewhat difficult for White to achieve bishop to e3. And it's a matter of personal taste which bishop you prefer in this kind of position. In my opinion, however, Black definitely doesn't have too much to worry about in this position. However, there are some benefits to playing this way for White, which is that if he thinks he can outplay his opponent, this is a very simple way to set up a solid, strategic game without too much to worry about. On the other hand, another benefit of the Vienna game is that if white is willing to take some risk, he definitely can force a sharp game with the move f4, as we talked about quite a bit earlier in the video. And let's take a look at that right now. After pawn to f4, black generally captures on f4 in this position since he does not have to worry about the move e5. And in this position, he also sets up a threat queen to h4 check. So in this position, white generally begins with the move knight to f3. And white's goal is simply to continue with the move pawn to d4, and then to capture this pawn on f4, setting up a commanding center, recovering the pawn, and gaining a big advantage in this position. But black has a great way to keep white from achieving this kind of easy life, and the excellent move here is actually to play the move pawn to g5. And this aggressive move, it solidifies the pawn on f4 temporarily, but at the same time it introduces the threat of playing the move pawn to g4, and this queen check will once again start to become very serious after that. Interestingly, some players enjoy this very risky situation with white, and there are some piece sacrifices white can try. For example, the most popular move here is pawn to h4, and now after pawn to g4, white has created a square for his knight with knight to g5. But now h6 does in fact trap the knight, and white follows through with his main idea, and as I said, there's some sacrificial ideas in this position, and that is knight takes f7. And after king takes f7, he can choose between the check on c4 or simply grabbing some center. Now, many of these sacrificial ideas have scored well for white. He's brought the king out into the center, right at the cost of a piece at the moment. These pawns are pretty shaky, so there are definite chances of building up an attack. But so far, theory and practice seem to show that if black is very strong or well prepared, he can probably handle these situations, and so the risk that white is taking on is quite high. But depending on the skill level of his opponent or his own confidence, white definitely can try his luck in these kinds of positions. Backing up to the initial position after knight to c3, white can achieve a more attractive version of the gambit if black plays the move knight to f6. And now, as we've mentioned, after pawn to f4, black doesn't usually take on f4 because of how strong the move e5 is. Now, if the gambit is just so much stronger in this position, why is it that black might choose to play the move knight to f6? Well, I think that if black plays knight to f6, this is the best way for him to get a good fighting position out of the game, since white is very likely to play f4, and the complications which arise give black ample chances for winning the game. By playing knight to f6, black is somewhat discouraging these more quiet lines with pawn to g3, since in these positions he can break open the position now with the move pawn to d5. And to give an example of how this would generally unfold after pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and bishop g2, black normally continues in this position with knight takes on c3, pawn takes knight, and bishop d6 covering the e5 pawn which was about to come after attack after this move knight to f3. So now play simply continues castling kingside, and I think that in this position black is happy that he's managed to open up the center, and all of his pieces will gain easy development, and white also has a somewhat weakened pawn structure. Certainly white has trumps here too, but all in all this position is equal, and black can be happy that he's introduced a few imbalances into the position. So instead, white goes straight in for the gambit with the move pawn to f4. And now, black's best reply is actually to continue on with this excellent counter thrust pawn to d5 anyway in this position. And it's this sharp move which keeps the position adequately balanced for black. Now, the solution for white here is to take on e5 with the pawn, and it's not too difficult to demonstrate that other moves are inferior. If white plays simply d3 in this position, trying to consolidate the e4 pawn, black's best option now is to play pawn takes pawn on f4. And notice here that the move e5 is not very strong because the knight does have access to the g4 square, and the threat of queen h4 check as well as knight takes e5 would be quite strong. So in this position instead, white takes on f4 with the bishop. But now after the quiet move, bishop b4, rather than capturing in the center, black sets up just way too many threats in this position. He's threatening to push the pawn ahead with d4, or to capture on e4, and white cannot maintain any real superiority in this position, theory has found. On the other hand, if white plays instead the move pawn takes pawn on d5, it looks like he might be winning a pawn in this position, since after the moves knight takes d5, he simply plays f takes e5. But here too, white finds that he runs into some serious difficulties after the move knight takes c3, b-pawn takes on c3, and now this annoying check, queen to h4 check. And because of the tactic, because of g3 followed by queen e4 check, picking up the rook, because of this tactic, white must actually play king e2 in this position. And now after the move bishop to g4 check, even though white has captured a pawn in this position and remains up a pawn, black clearly has a lot of compensation since the king is floating around in the center. In fact, some adventurous grandmasters have been willing to play this position with white, but the general feeling about this position is that white is probably taking a little bit too much risk, and black has full compensation for the pawn. Backing up to the position after d5, white's best move here is definitely to play pawn takes pawn on e5, when black will certainly play knight takes pawn on e4. Now it might look like knight takes e4 is a strong idea for white, since it leaves what appears to be a symmetrical situation in the center, and since it's white's move, maybe he can pick up the pawn first. But in fact, this position is definitely not good for white, since there is a difference between the two structures, and that is that white has used his f-pawn, and black has used his d-pawn. And it's because of this factor that white actually faces far too many problems here. Black easily gets his light-squared bishop developed in the game, and at the same time, white's king is vulnerable because of the missing f-pawn. It's vulnerable to check on h4, it's vulnerable to the diagonal bishop c5, and because of these factors, white does not capture the knight on e4. Instead, a better option for white is to simply play the move knight to f3, and there's many ways this position can go, but it's likely to remain roughly balanced. Another option here is to lay an interesting trap with this move pawn to d3. And it looks like in this position, black should be able to simply play queen to h4 check, since after the move pawn to g3, black can always play knight takes g3, taking advantage of the pin. However, it turns out that this position is a trap. White plays in this position the move knight to f3, and now black has no choice but to play queen h5, maintaining the pin, but it would appear that this would work. However, white has the very strong move knight takes d5, and theory has shown that despite the fact that black definitely can try moves like knight takes h1, theory has shown repeatedly that this position is not good for black. Black simply faces too much pressure. His king is actually the one which will end up being vulnerable, and white should have no trouble staying ahead in material in this position. However, if black knows about this trap, he does not need to play the move queen to h4 check. Instead, after d3, he can continue to play for a balanced game after the move knight takes c3, b takes c3, and now instead of allowing white to play d3 to d4, black himself plays the move d4, an outstanding move, and this clearly disallows white from bringing a pawn there, and theory holds that black has at least equal chances after, for example, knight f3, which does offer this pawn as a sacrifice, but of course white can definitely recover that pawn. Black instead typically maintains the pawn with knight c6, and play is often continued here, bishop e2, bishop c5, and I think in this position white definitely has some chances to create an imbalanced game, but the position is definitely equal. That's all for today. I hope you've enjoyed this tour of the Vienna game. Black shouldn't have too much to fear in these positions if he's done his homework and has a little bit of knowledge about how to treat these positions. On the other hand, the Vienna game does allow white to choose between steering the game towards more positional waters or taking risk with the gambit play f4. And I think it's this reason, this This chance for white to steer the game into whatever channel he would like, that allows the Vienna to remain popular with many players on the club level. That's it for today, and I look forward to seeing you again.